Thank you for joining us this week for our Sunday School Teacher's Overview of the lesson this week for Luke 18, verses 9 through 17. First Baptist Angleton members, teachers, we're very excited because just about all of our classes are getting back to being live and in person again. So some of you joining in for the first time in a while, we're grateful to have you. And also, during this interim time, we have picked up dozens of teachers from across the country now who've been listening in to this YouTube video. So we're grateful for you. Thank you for joining in. I hope that this will give you some hints and helps for your lesson as you prepare for Sunday. And I want you to know I pray for all of you for the lesson this week. Now this Sunday, again, we have another marvelous text, Luke 18, 9 to 17. The Sunday school lesson gives it the title, Worthy. I might call it, Where's Your Trust? And again, and I know I've said this is like 3 weeks in a row, I've said this, context is vital. The last 2 or 3 weeks I pointed out the context of a familiar passage is very important and it needs to be considered because the whole lesson hinges on it. Well, it's that way this week as well. Don't miss how this familiar parable begins in verse 9. It says, and he, Jesus, also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. That's the context. That's why Jesus told this story. Don't miss this. It's the whole reason this parable exists in Scripture, because Jesus wanted to correct some people who, number one, trusted in their own righteousness, and number two, looked down on others. That is what this whole thing is about. So don't miss that context and where this all came from. Now, looking at the lesson, one possible way for you to begin is with an evaluation question. And many of you have heard this question before. It's been used over the years to help evaluate where a person's trust is for their salvation. And it's to ask the question, if you were to stand before God and he were to ask you, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you tell him? Well, see, that's such a good question because the answer they give to that question shows where their trust is. If they say, well, I've tried to do my best and go to church and keep the 10 Commandments, you know their trust is in themselves, in their good deeds. But if they say, I trust that Jesus died on the cross for my sins, you know their faith is in him. Now, you could go about using this question in a couple of different ways if you feel led to use it in your class. Number one, maybe you could write this question on the board. Maybe even have it up there when they walk in, or you could just write it on the board as you begin your lesson and have everybody read it and think to themselves what their answer would be. And then you can go ahead from there and start your lesson and talk about the difference and where their trust should be. Or number two, you could actually have some pieces of paper prepared and ready, maybe even with that question on it, and say, write down what would your answer be to this question. You can read it. Say, write down what your answer would be. Say, I'm not going to take these up. Nobody else is going to see it. I just want you to write this down so you can see what your answer is because it's important. See, that could be helpful because then they'll hold that through the lesson, and then later when you talk about where their trust is, they can actually look there in black and white at what they wrote, that maybe at the beginning of the class they wrote, well, I'm going to church or doing good deeds or whatever. That could be very convicting to them to see in black and white that they were saying their trust was in the wrong place. So just a suggestion. I'm not telling you how to teach the lesson, but just suggestions always. But this whole lesson is about trust. Remember in the introduction in verse 9, it says Jesus told this parable to people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. So the whole lesson is about trust. Where is your trust for salvation? So some of the discussion questions maybe you could use for this lesson, you could talk about what are some things that are trustworthy? Or again, what are some things that are not trustworthy? A whole bunch of things people say, oh, you can trust this, you can't trust that. But one of the points you should make is trust or faith in itself does not save a person. It is the object of trust that saves. You know, someone once said faith is only as good as the object in which it's placed. You can have your trust in something and have it be a misplaced trust. I remember reading, this is an example, you may have another example like it, of misplaced trust. I remember reading in the paper about a stuntman in Florida who used to get publicity by climbing up tall buildings. But one day he fell to his death, and when they came to him, they found a glob of mud in his hand. He'd reached out to what he thought was a concrete ledge to grab and pull himself up. It turned out to be merely a concrete colored daub of mud that a bug or a bird had built up there. He trusted it was concrete. He had faith that it was going to hold him, but his trust was in the wrong thing. So faith or trust is only as good as the object in which it is placed. And that's what this parable is all about. Yes, it's about these two different men, the Pharisee and the publican or the tax collector. And if your class is set up this way and they do good at this, you might have them just read the passage and compare these two men. What all differences do you see? That'd be kind of an interesting thing for them to do. What all differences do you see between these two men? Well, their jobs were different. One was a Pharisee, one was a tax collector. Their postures in their prayer was different. You can find several things in the text like that. But make sure you make the biggest point. The biggest difference in these two is where their trust was for their salvation. What did the Pharisee trust? He trusted in his works. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all I get. See, he was trusting in the things that he did. What did the tax collector trust? All he had to trust was the mercy of God. God be merciful to me, a sinner. His only trust and hope was in God. Now, those of you from First Baptist Angleton, the publican or the tax collector is the perfect example of what we studied just a couple of weeks ago in the Beatitudes. Beatitude number 1, blessed are the poor in spirit. The person who realizes that you are a spiritual beggar before God, you have no good works. The only hope you have of getting into heaven is to trust Jesus. So the poor in spirit. The tax collector here is a perfect example of the person who's poor in spirit. And what did Jesus say is the reward for the poor in spirit? Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Trust Jesus alone and not your good works, and you'll be in the kingdom of heaven. Remember the words from the old hymn, Rock of Ages, that fit this so well. One of the lines in that hymn says, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. To me, that line out of that song, pictures this parable of the Pharisee and the publican so well. The Pharisee was bringing all these things in his hands to God. God, look, I'm better than this other guy. God, look, I fast twice a week. God, look, I pay tithes of all I get. He thought he had all this stuff in his hands that he could show God. He was trusting his works. But the publican or the tax collector had nothing in his hands, no good works, no good deeds. All he could do is just beat his chest. He could have used the same words out of that hymn. Lord, nothing in my hands I bring. Simply to the cross I cling. And see, that's where our trust has to be too. Our trust has to be in what Jesus did for us on the cross and not our own works. Now, don't miss verse 14, where Jesus says, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went to his house justified rather than the other. Notice two important words here. Number one, the word justified. He was justified. Word justified means made just, made right, saved. This man was saved before God. So he was justified, but then Jesus said, rather than the other. See, this is important. It's not that they were both saved or one was just a little better than the other. No, one was saved rather than the other. The one who trusted in his works was not saved. He was not made right with God. So you've got to put your trust in what Jesus did, and Jesus did alone for your salvation. So when you've talked about that through the lesson, this is where maybe you could come back and say, how did you answer that question in the beginning? Or look at the answer you wrote on this paper as you began this class. Were you trusting things that you did? Or were you trusting Jesus' death on the cross? And maybe it'd be a time to lead your class in a prayer of salvation. You know, if you've been trusting yourself, pray a prayer like the tax collector prayed, God be merciful to me, a sinner, and ask Jesus to save you. Not because of the good things you've done for him, but because the good thing he did for you when he died on the cross to pay for your sins. And just a couple other things. Another good discussion question you could introduce your class if they like to discuss these kinds of things could be, Is there a difference between the things the Pharisee in this parable told God about himself, and a person just looking at their spiritual fruit as they assess their salvation? Is there a difference between those two? Is there a legitimate place to look at some things you're doing and see if that's spiritual fruit? And I'd say, yes, there is a difference. It is good to evaluate ourselves. 2 Corinthians 13 says, examine yourself, test yourself, and see whether you be in the faith. 1 John points out all kinds of fruit by which we can test if we're the children of God. But the difference here is the Pharisee looked at the things he did as justifying himself before God. He trusted in them for his salvation. The genuine Christian is not going to trust these things for his salvation. He's just going to say, I think there is fruit that shows God's grace is working in my life. I'm not trusting them for my salvation. I'm trusting it's what Jesus did on the cross. But you could talk about that. You could also ask, how does this concept we're looking at today eliminate holier than thou attitudes in the church? Well, the answer is because if we know we're only saved by God's mercy, then we can't look down on anybody else, right? If we know that our only hope of salvation is not anything that we've done, but only trusting what Jesus did on the cross, then we can't look down on anybody else. As the old saying goes, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. We're all sinners. We're all just saved by trusting Jesus. But it all comes back to trust. It's what this whole lesson is about, trust. What are you trusting for your salvation? Are you trusting something you have done, or are you trusting God's mercy in Jesus on the cross? So much here. I just hope this will help you get started as you prepare for Sunday, and I'll be praying for you as you do that.